Haven is a curious game. It revolves around two characters who are in love and who find themselves forced to elope in order to be together. When you think about it, it doesn't sound very different from many other stories, but where it manages to distinguish itself from the rest is its presentation. You see, in Haven, we really get to experience the relationship up close and personal. The game even features local co-op where one player can take over the female character and the other over the male one. It all feels like it was made to be played by couples, so I quickly summoned my wife and we played a bit of it together. Yes, just a bit. After 2 hours, I continued to play alone, and I will tell you why shortly. But first, I have to praise the game's support of ultra-wide resolutions. No matter if 32:9 or 21:9, the game supports it all and looks great while doing it. As for the game, it starts off with our protagonist being on what looks like a random planet uninhabited by anyone else. We get to move around, pick fruit, stuff like that, nothing very interesting at first, while the game is introducing us to its world and its core mechanics. Not much is known at this point, but it is pretty obvious by the jet boots and overall appearance of our guys that they live in the distant future. Haven takes its time when it comes to explaining why we are on this planet and mostly wants to show us how in love our heroes are with each other. That would be fine if the game didn't overdo it with the lovey-dovey cheesiness. At times, I was cringing while listening to the dialogue, and it happened more and more as I progressed through the story. And speaking of the dialogue, the game is voiced quite well. The music and the visuals only serve to complement these first impressions. Remember how I mentioned that you can play local co-op? Well, what about the online one, you ask? There's no such option. That's it. And the reason for that is pretty obvious once you've tried it. The co-op is mostly a lie. The game is generally designed around the idea of one player who controls both characters. They can't even separate for more than a few meters, nor can they do anything on their own. It goes as far as forcing both players to pick a dialogue choice together. For example, even if you control the guy and it is his turn to pick what to say, the player who controls him has to agree with the player who doesn't control him on what they want to pick. You cannot do it in any other way. There's no minigame or any other mechanism of deciding who gets to pick what is to be said. You simply have to agree amongst each other. This is particularly stupid since normally each player controls one character. So it would make much more sense if that player gets to pick the dialogue options for that particular character unilaterally instead of, having to basically agree with the other character. You cannot, for example, choose two different options. What happens is you're just stuck. Nothing happens until you both agree on one option and then choose that option. It's all made worse by the fact that it is actually easier for the second player to just not control their character while the first one guides where they're going. This, for example, when you're moving. If you try to resist the movement, all that happens is you get teleported back next to your main character. Here's an analogy that might help you understand what we're dealing with. I don't know if you know the game Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons. It's actually a single player game where you are supposed to simultaneously control two brothers. The challenge comes from the fact that you have to control both brothers simultaneously in order to perform tasks which require a certain degree of synchronization. You can, however, have one player control one brother on a gamepad and then another player control another brother on a different gamepad. It's not how it's intended to be played, but you can definitely do it. It seems like the developers knew this and that's why they programmed it, so that if you wanna instead try to play the game as a two-player local co-op, so to speak of, you could. And while this makes some things easier, it also makes other things harder because now two people have to sync up their actions, which comes with its own challenges. Well, Haven does absolutely the same thing, but much worse, since there are almost never any tasks that require such teamwork. The co-op was just added to lure in couples, if you ask me, who want to play the game and feel like they're doing something together. That's why I played alone after 2 hours with my wife. This is not a co-op game, and it's pointless to play it with another person because that second person is going to be bored. They do effectively nothing. There's only one part of the game where this actually makes a little bit of sense, and by that I mean having a second player, and that is the combat system, which reminds me a bit of older RPG games. Both sides line up and you have dynamic turns. This means that you don't have to wait for someone to attack before it's your turn to attack yourself, but rather you can strike as soon as a certain cooldown is over. The reason why co-op would work here is because each side controls one character, and it can be interesting to time certain attacks together in order to hit enemies when they're in a weakened state, for example, since those are relatively short windows that are given to the player. The heroes can also perform in individual attacks or attack together as one, which creates a stronger attack but needs to be timed right. This actually makes the combat more challenging because every such attack needs to be charged up before you can release it. When I play alone, I can start charging both characters at the same time, meaning that I optimize my attack patterns due to the perfect synchronization. I know after all when I want to perform it, and I can start immediately with both hands. When playing co-op, you have to actually suggest a combined attack to your partner, then both of you need to start charging as close to each other as possible so that you can charge up at the same time and release as soon as possible. If one charges up sooner, he just needs to hold for a quarter of a second longer until the other one catches up, and then again you can release. That's not a problem. But as you can see, all of this costs you a few seconds more, which gives the enemies time to hit you one more time since their cooldowns also pass and they will strike. This doesn't really mean that the game becomes difficult or anything. It is generally designed to be relatively easy, and I actually only managed to die once. You can make it harder if you want to, but this seems rather pointless since the combat is simple and boring. You have a ranged attack and a melee attack, and some enemies are resistant to one of them. That's the short version of it. There really isn't much going on here, and even with the addition of more complicated combat scenarios in the later parts of the game, where an enemy is only vulnerable under some conditions or at a certain time, it doesn't make the combat any more fun. It's just tedious, and by the end I was attempting to avoid it as much as I could. Our characters can level up as well. The issue here is that the game doesn't tell you anything about how that works at first. At some point, your experience bar just turns into 2 glasses when it's full. 2 glasses like the ones to drink from. I had no idea what this means, although I knew that I had reached max XP, but there was no information about what needed to be done next. Your gameplay loop will revolve around exploring various floating islands on the planet and returning to your aircraft, which also doubles as a base of operations, and this is where your characters can actually level up. They drink a special wine that they brew, talk a bunch before you see a few minor stat increases, and that's pretty much it. And these stat increases, mind you, cannot be influenced by the player. It's all pre-designed. You see a certain screen and it just tells you, okay, now your attack is increased by 1 point. That's it. And I really didn't notice that much of a improvement after each level. The exploration part of the game is repetitive as well. The levels are divided into small areas, and while you go from one to the other, there isn't much else to do. There are almost no shortcuts, so going back to the ship is an annoying endeavor. You have to pass through all the individual levels you came through in order to get to your location right now, and there are short loading screens between all of them. Most of the areas have these red puddles called rust, which taint the area and creatures within it. If you purge all of these and defeat all the tainted enemies, you can unlock that island for fast travel. The bad news is that fast travel is also overly complicated. In order to use it, you need to lure a special flying creature which takes you to where you want to be. For that, however, you need to cook food, which you need to use as bait by placing it on a specified location in order to summon said flyer. The problem with this is that such summoning spots are only available at certain islands or levels, call them as you will. One is next to your ship so that you can go anywhere from there. So basically from your base you can go to anywhere else. But if you want to go back to your ship, more often than not, you will have to run, since there almost always won't be any summoning spots on that particular level. Those are actually quite rare. And again, let's not forget that a level needs to be completely purified of all rust before you may actually fast travel to it. There's one major problem I have with this game, but before I move on to that, I would like to first address a few positive things. The first thing I want to praise is the fact that the game is designed to be played on a gamepad and will recognize a PS4 controller. As a consequence of this, you will also get the correct button prompts, which is really nice. I absolutely hate it when I use my PS4 controllers and some games don't recognize it, and then you get the button prompts for an Xbox controller, which is positioned very differently, and therefore, for example, the X there is a completely different button from the X on a PS4 controller. It's not a big deal, you can get used to it, but it is nice when the game actually recognizes it and gives you the correct prompts from the start without the need to add any additional software or even get used to it. Another thing I liked was the fact that you can pet pretty much all the animals you encounter. You know me, I'm all about petting the good boys and girls. They deserve some love too, and that is definitely the case here, so it's a good thing that you can pet them as much as you want. I did mention how the graphics of the game look really nice altogether, but I want to emphasize on that here. The characters themselves also look kind of nice, and while the whole graphical engine that is at play here is pretty simplistic. It still works really well because they used very nice and bright colors, and the game is, on top of that, not particularly power hungry, so it will run smoothly even on weaker systems. In my 16 hours of gameplay, I did not encounter any bugs, and the game never crashed on me. So those were the positive things that I wanted to mention. With that being said, allow me to tell you about some major issues I have with this game. I did mention how our characters can be very lovey-dovey at times, and it can be very cringe-inducing. The game really goes above and beyond at showing you how deeply in love our heroes are with each other. You have constant conversations, and if they are not about romantic nonsense, of which I can handle quite a bit, but this was just so much of it. And anyway, as I said, if it's not that, it's some pseudoscience that they're presenting. I have no problem with games which more or less invent nonsense and present it as science, but it starts to get on my nerves when the game really goes deep into it, and now you are listening to a 5-minute conversation about absolute nonsense which is presented to you as science. It seems like they really want to let you know what they invented and how it works in their pseudoscience universe. And there's no necessity for that. The player does not have to be convinced that the rocket boots work because it's grounded within really complicated future science with lots of invented words. Nobody wants to listen to this. My wife is a physicist and she hated it because it was stupid. I'm not a physicist and I hated it because it made no sense and lasts way too long. It's clear that they don't want to portray our protagonists as stupid people. They gave them a background which indicates that they're very talented and smart. The guy's a biologist, the girl's an engineer who, by the way, built her own spaceship in her teenage years. We get it. They're geniuses. That's fine. You don't have to convince us with these super long, boring conversations. And speaking of conversations, I'm usually someone who is all about the story in a game. I play Metal Gear Solid games and I watch every cutscene without skipping anything. Well, this game made me skip more and more of the conversations as time passed. There is just so much being said without anything meaningful to extract from these conversations. It's like they talked for a minute and they spoke about nothing in the end. The worst part is that the developers couldn't make up their minds about the game's target audience. Our characters can't curse normally. They will instead use children's versions of popular swear words. They will say things like bloop or blooping instead of an insult. They will say, this blooping person did this, or oh, look at this bloop. The point is they use these kiddie versions of insults because they really don't want to say anything that might be, I don't know, spicy? I don't know. The fact of the matter is that no real insults are ever used. And I will not agree with the idea that this is some version of evolution of the words in the future. Trust me, when insults evolve, they don't become less offensive. They become more offensive over time, or at least equally offensive. The point is that it seems like every other part of their language is consistent with today's English, but when it comes to these insults, they're always using just these two words more or less. The sex within the game is also never shown, just heavily implied. There are scenes where they start making out and then we see them dress afterwards, so the actual intercourse is never shown. The way the characters interact with each other is also quite immature, and it reminds me more of people in their early teenage years, and it seems like they're still figuring out what a relationship should look like. Something like that is very strange. In any case, it does not correspond to their looks and to what the story is telling us. These guys are supposed to be in their mid to late 20s. That's actually very annoying to me because they behave like kiddies. And I would have accepted this if the game was consistent with it. It doesn't swear, it doesn't show sex, the romance is super immature in its presentation. Yeah, sure, that would have worked fine if there were not scenes like the ones I am going to play to you now. Just watch this, watch the conversation, watch how it plays out, what words are being used, and then we'll continue.
Then helps take years off. Your breasts are pressed against his burning chest. Kay puts his hand behind your neck, and a shiver goes through your body. You can no longer hear the commotion outside. Your spirit is captured by the taste of his saliva, the smell of his sweat.
I let him have his way.
Kay's lips slide along your cheek. His hand slides along your spine. You can feel his penis rubbing on your stomach. And as Kay sinks his teeth into your neck...
Okay, stop. Stop talking. Show me.
Yeah, so would you say that this scene fits with the rest of the immature and innocent presentation? In my opinion, it's not. And don't get me wrong, I have no problem with vulgar scenes, with sex scenes in games and stuff. All of this is okay for me. After all, I'm a mature player, I'm a grown-up, but the fact of the matter is that the rest of the game is not being like this. So it would seem like they can't decide who they're actually making a game for and what rules they want to hold on to. Personally, I feel like the game suffers from a bit of an anime syndrome. Most of the time you will see such weird and awkward behavior in anime series. It's probably a cultural thing, but has always been very strange to me why the Japanese do it like that. You see these grown people being portrayed in ways that make no sense in the real world. Haven is developed by a French indie developer, so it's even stranger to me to see some of these things in a game made by Europeans. Mind you, it can always be worse, but that's not really something you want to hear about your script. I mean, even the names of our characters sound Japanese. The girl is named Yu, the guy is called Kei. Anyway, it's time for me to draw the line and see where we stand. Haven promised me an adventure I could play in co-op. That was basically a lie. Yeah, you can play it like that, but it hurts the experience. The gameplay is repetitive and becomes boring, the story is mundane and lacks any interesting twists, the conversations get so annoying due to the teenage level of romance or the terrible pseudoscience that I actually started skipping them, and last but not least, the combat is simply tedious. I wanted to like this game because it looks nice and tried something you don't see very often. It features ultra-wide support and, as mentioned, promises co-op. The soundtrack is also really nice, but sadly with all of its negatives, I simply cannot recommend this game to pretty much anyone. It's not appropriate for younger players, although it initially creates that impression, and it will annoy mature ones exactly because it's not mature enough in its presentation, not by far. It seems to me that the developers wrote a script which pretty much pushes everyone away for one reason or another. While the game is cheap at only €25 and offers between 10 to 15 hours of gameplay depending on how much you feel compelled to purify all the levels, I feel that most people will end up giving up on the game before its conclusion. I know I was very often tempted to do so. Now on another note, have you noticed the rebranding of the channel? Only one person is giving me any feedback yet, and I would love to receive some more. So go ahead and let me know what you think of it in the comment section of this video. I always appreciate any feedback. With that being said, I won't take any more of your time. Thank you for watching my videos and have a great day.